Welcome to a conversation about Jesus and hell. Not a topic we normally engage, but it's going to be interesting. It's Brian McLaren's chapter 24 in his book, We Make the Way by Walking. And I preached on it this morning and gave my own additional comments, but I would like to start with something I did not preach on. Because the question I'm going to ask of you, our two guests that are with us today, in the center is Bob Case. He is the pastor emeritus of this church here, Alpena First Congregational United Church of Christ. He was the one in the pulpit before me for, what was it, 20 years?
19 and a half.
19 and a half, almost 20.
Almost 20.
20 years here.
Got to get that right.
And now he's retired, but still a member of the church. And this morning he was preaching in Atlanta, Michigan, at the First Congregational United Church of Christ there. And we have with us the former minister of that, I think, and this is Ginny Titus, Reverend Ginny Titus. And you were at that Atlanta church, I believe, for 10 years, weren't you, as the minister?
It's hard to believe you were there that long.
And I feel out of place now. I'm retired. I don't have my collar on anymore.
You didn't have to preach this
You
morning.
are collared, yeah.
Great. Well, again, the question that we'll first deal with is what struck us in this chapter or in the sermon today on Jesus and hell. But I wanted to say what first struck me, that provoked me actually, such that I did not include it in my sermon. It's the last part of his chapter. He says this: belief in the afterlife, it turned out, provided a benefit for those who wanted to recruit people for violent revolution. They could promise heaven to those who died as martyrs in a holy war. And that connection between death in battle and reward in heaven helps explain why the Pharisees joined forces with the Zealots in the year 67 to lead a revolt against the Romans. So it was used as a means to promise people a life in the hereafter. If they would just behave in certain violent, offensive, brutal ways in this world, they'd be guaranteed a hero's hereafter. The other part, this is his final page, in page 114. He says, the real purpose for Jesus' fire and brimstone language was not to predict the destruction of the universe or to make absolute for all eternity insider-outsider categories of us and them. Its purpose was to wake up complacent people, to warn them of the danger of their current path, and challenge them to change. And he used the strongest language and imagery available. Sadly, many religious people still use this imagery of hell more in the conventional way that Jesus sought to reverse. Like Jonah, they seem disappointed that God's grace might get the final word. If more of us would re-examine this dimension of Jesus' teaching, we would see what a courageous, subversive, and fascinating leader he was, pointing us to a radically different way of seeing God, life, and being alive. I was struck that the use that Jesus had of hell as violent imagery or as punishment or as dividing of us versus them was used to actually cause people to think differently about what they're doing in this world. And that was the inspiring part to me, is it isn't really about that hereafter. It's your imaginings of the hereafter causing people to think and act differently in the here and now. So that was the part that struck me, and partly offended by this notion that violent revolution is one way to get yourself into heaven. But secondly, I think he's onto something seriously there. So between the two of you, how about Ginny, would you go first with just something that struck you, that provoked or disturbed or intrigued you in this particular conversation?
I immediately thought about a professor of mine, the whole thing about rewards in heaven and all that. If you think about the afterlife as a place that holds promises for you, the best promises were the ones Jesus gave, because they weren't magic tricks, they weren't magic anything. They were instead the ability to enrich your life, as you said, right here. He once said, I'm a universal salvationist. Not everybody is. And in seminary, they sure weren't. But he said to me, I'm always praying you're right. And so that was for me a great answer. He said, I can't buy it yet, but I'm always praying you're right. So the whole thing about going to whatever heaven looks like, and I always tell everyone, if anyone ever tells you what it looks like, just say, I'm sorry, you're wrong, because no one knows. But we are promised, and we are promised life eternal. So we wouldn't be put in a place that isn't just marvelous. So
I'm with
other
you.
than that,
If
I
that
don't
makes
have-
me a universal salvationist or whatever you call it, I'm with you all the way on that.
Yeah.
So one thing in particular that may have struck you, a particular lesson that intrigued, provoked, disturbed, or challenged?
Well, having taught history of religions, I found it very interesting that he talked about Zoroastrianism and Greek mythology, and how much, if you read the Old Testament as Old Testament, and you separate everything, that comes after, say, the Babylonian captivity, there's no mention of hell. There's no mention of Satan. That is totally foreign. God is the author of both good and evil in the Old Testament, and that's a problem for Israel. They struggle with it. How could God be the author of good and evil at the same time? And then when they went to the Babylonian captivity, they came in touch with the Persians, because that was toward the end, that was Persia, and Zoroastrianism, which was the first monotheistic religion, even possibly before Judaism. And they had a single God, but they had, I was going to look up the names before I came here, but didn't have time.
The judging angels.
They have the judging angels. They have a good angel, and they have a satanic kind of
Mithras.
Yes, and that touched Judaism during the Babylonian captivity. They incorporated it into their religion, and then they brought it back to Jerusalem. And the reason I wanted to say that is illustrative of what happens to a living religion. That our image of hell is Dante's Inferno. I mean, hell did not look, up until Dante, probably much like we think of it at all. But Dante came along, did that circular thing in the rings of getting to hell, and the culture picked that up. So you wonder what our culture is picking up now. How do we deal with heaven and hell when there are billions of galaxies and 13 billion years of history of the universe? Now, the reason I say that is we have to interpret the text as a living religion as it relates to us in 2019, almost at 18. We can't go back and pick something whole cloth and then plop it down now and say, oh, look, this has always been that way. And I think he points out, no, a living religion gathers things in from its culture.
And also causes those folks in the exile had to deal with that theology that they were being inundated with
Right.
in Babylon from the Persian, Zoroastrian. So they had to speak in those languages to try to tell their story. Well, once we've done that, it sounds as though you're teaching what they're teaching. You're thinking what they're thinking.
But they've altered it.
But they've had to use that contemporary language to get through what's different about our Sabbath laws from your Midraic laws, or what's different about our rituals from your rituals. They had to use that language. Then it gets embedded in the Bible story. So then Jesus has to use that language in his contemporary day to try to turn it on its head in order to reverse how they're doing, look at the world differently. And then here we are 2,000 years later, and we're having to inherit all those little pieces of baggage along the way if we're going to try to make a statement about our sense of the hereafter.
But what you just did was explain the creation of the Bible and the creation of the church. It's an ongoing, living history. You just can't go back and say, okay, Matthew 16:42, whatever, and say...
means this and always has.
Always has.
And always will.
Uh,
It's organic. It's
But
like-
also
It's
shows the...
living organic. Those two great words. Living meaning that it's something that has dynamics in it. Even the title of the book, we make the road by walking. It's not just the road is there. It's that we actually are going to make it as we walk it, as we travel together. We're finding where the journey is leading.
And your sermon, which I didn't hear this morning, but I read, you had to deal with the issue of we don't live in a three-story universe now, where there's God up in heaven and hell below, or some kind of image like that. You had to create and speak, and I think did very well, what do these words mean today? And the one question I always have about it, Jenny, are the people come up to me and they say, what about Hitler? You know, what about Stalin? What about the great, I'm a universalist also, but I thought maybe you would have an answer.
I do have an answer for that. I read it by a man named Griffith, who does a lot of prison ministry. And there are people there wondering what's going to happen to them after they die. Is it going to be judgment, punishment, all that? And I'll ignore God. I will deny God. Then God can't touch me. And Griffith says, you can go to hell. You can actually just decide you're going to do that. And God will follow you there. And he'll sit at table with you. And he'll say, I'm here. I'm still waiting for you. God will not, the hound of heaven will even meet you there.
Well, that's process. You know, that heaven isn't a static place you sit on a cloud playing a harp. But if we're truly alive after death, then there's new experience. There's new reality. It isn't just I don't know what it is either, but I just can't believe it's static.
I'm struck with your comments too of a doctrine that isn't spoken about much in our Protestant churches, and that is the harrowing of hell. That is the thought that when Jesus descended into death, he actually entered into the realm, the underworld. He went into that land of the undead, or however it was being imagined, and opened the doors, opened the windows, let in the light, let in the freshness, invited those who were already buried to enter into heaven.
Right.
The harrowing of hell. There's no one is outside the reach and the embrace of God's love and grace and forgiveness.
That's why I picked this chapter, because I wrote on that for Dark Saturday, and no one at seminary had ever done a Dark Saturday sermon. So I got extra credit for doing that. But it was a sermon about just that God had to experience every part of everything.
Of life itself.
Jesus he lived a life on earth, and he, I think, needed to immerse himself in what even in the people's minds had happened to their loved ones. Where did they go? What were they doing there? Were they being punished? Were they being tormented? One of the questions you've asked every group, and I think we'll probably have to hit it today, is what are you going to take away from this? Or what is the... And I think the thing that struck me the very most about the whole chapter was, how are we identified? Because that was so important to the Jewish people. I think if I'm right, it's 614 laws that you could break every day of your life. From how you wore your hat to if you wore your hat to what you ate, how you prepared it. 614 ways, which is just silly for us to think about. That wasn't for the Jewish people then, and if you read Leviticus, which they could have skipped for me.
Well, that's where a lot of those rules came from.
That's where a lot of those rules came from. The idea that people were so to the letter, married to all those rules, did not allow for the change that came when Jesus said, I didn't come to break all the laws, I just came to show you what to do with your life here. And so he wanted people to then take this love, forgiveness, every good part that Jesus changed the faith to. And it wasn't that the Jewish people weren't good people or weren't trying to do good things. But at the time, that was what was happening, and people were trying to follow the ancient laws.
I think part of that ancient law is it's a rule-keeping religion. And that is here, if you just show us the rules, tell us what the checklist is, give us a monitor, and we'll monitor our day, we'll monitor and we'll monitor each other. Mm-hmm. I'll keep them all as best I can, but I'm also watching to make sure you do it. And if you don't, I'll catch you and I'll catch you. So right. I think that rule-keeping was the whole way of doing the religion. not that there was anything wrong with any of the rules. They had their reasons for being, and they arose, again, in a living religion. Over time, they evolved into what they were. But the key thing is, Jesus came along and said, the two rules are, do you love God wholeheartedly with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength? Do you? And then you also, are you loving your neighbor like you love yourself? Because if you are, all 614 are covered.
I got this sense, have you ever been hit with a bucket of cold ice water?
Yeah.
I got the sense that that's what Jesus was doing, was hitting
ice
people
water.
with a cold. Because whether it's 614, 650, it gets to the point where who cares? The average person, the guy like
Ordinary,
us,
common person.
they were gone. I mean, there's no way they could even think about keeping those rules. I remember I was on a cruise once, and it was a Saturday, and we were walking back to our cabin, and there was a guy standing there by the door. And he said, I need your help. And I said, what do you need? And he said, could you use my key and let me in my room?
Oh.
Because he couldn't work on the Sabbath, and operating an electronic key on the Sabbath. Now, he was trying to be very faithful, a deeply religious person, and probably a very good person. But Jesus says there's stuff that's more important than that. And you take Lazarus, he said to people when he warned them about hell, it was the very people that everybody thought were cool. And I think that's the other thing.
But that was the parable that we had as one of the two in today's reading. The rich man is assumed to be the successful one, to be the blessed one, to be the one who has plenty of food, wonderful house to live in, and he steps over and totally ignores or disregards the beggar right at his own doorstep. So it says now in the hereafter, those roles get reversed. That was a shock, because I'm sure the rule-keeping religion said he's kept all the rules, he's obviously blessed, God must bless him in this world, and so he'll be blessed hereafter. And obviously this one who's sitting in the gutter, he's got the dogs are licking his sores, he's starving to death, he's obviously cursed, he's done something, and so they'll blame the victim for the situation. And then turn around, and in the hereafter, Abraham says, Lazarus, Lazar, my mercy.
That is a scary parable for me. I know when I was living in Chicago and there were people sitting on the street begging, and you go down to the subway or the L, and they were sitting there waiting, and people, including myself, were just stepping over them. How many people like that have I walked by? Not knowing it, or just so much a part of the background that I didn't even think about it. I mean, if we stop and think that Lazarus is me, Lazarus can be any one of us. How many people do we walk by? And if we do see them, sometimes there is such an overwhelming sense of helplessness. What do I do? I think there's a lot of us that have that same kind of a Lazarus struggle, and Jesus is saying, okay, it's like the Good Samaritan. How many of us righteous people walked by the victim because we were doing something important we just didn't see? And I think that's the thing that worries me, that concerns me the most, is the number of people I don't see. And they must be numerous. If there isn't universal salvation, then I think I'm in trouble.
I think one thing in that parable that is helpful is this is somebody who daily was at his door while he was inside eating his meal. It wasn't that the rich man is out traveling by and seeing how many homeless shelters there are and things, but rather this is the one who's right here, literally your neighbor. Mm-hmm. And if you cannot even assist your neighbor who has an obvious need, and you've got an abundance you can help out, it's not even about the next one you cross over as you're heading downtown. So I think if there's any way to help us understand, is the one person who's right next to you that you can do something, share your sandwich.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes it's not as obvious as someone by the door. I remember Keith and I got into maybe one of the few real arguments we ever had. And it was after we started working at the res, and we worked on the reservation for 20 years total, still are, but lived there 10 years. There's a thing that you sometimes bypass. If you live in Alpena, you have a lot of people and a lot of neighbors and we're all doing better than most anybody on the reservation. But does that mean that there aren't lonely people here, that there aren't sick people to help, that there aren't every possible thing that could be wrong in a human life is happening here on another level? But is it as bad? And Keith would say, it can't touch the reservation. I said, it can for here. And so we talked a lot about that, about we can't just handpick the Bowery in New York, which my folks took me to when I was a kid, so I could see where the really poor people were.
Skid Row.
Skid Row. And so that whole thing, I still think, though, that the question he begs us to ask, without even maybe really asking it, is how do we want ourselves identified? Do we want to be what he says is have religious knowledge? Well, it helps. It helps some. Not everybody's going to do that. Some people just do it organically, and there's nothing absolutely wrong with that. Any way that God can come to you. Observe the laws, follow good rules, socially respected. Well, I don't know. Maybe if everybody likes me too much, I'm not out rabble-rousing enough, and trying to do something that I should be doing. Economically prosperous, that I can't even think about. Healthy in body. Have you ever read about so many lepers in your whole life than you read about in Scripture? But there was the AIDS in late 70s, and there are people that were avoiding that whole group of people. And then we found out that it's not as contagious. For us, we can hug them. We can do, okay, no one knew that because this was a new thing. Okay, we have all those things, and then we have people judging who you are because of having no money. Someone said last week, I think, there was a person who couldn't continue coming to the church. They didn't feel comfortable because they didn't have good clothes.
Overalls.
Yeah, didn't have good clothes. Okay, that's another way they perceive being judged. The whole judgment.
Yes. I think if I can, I
Yeah.
hope I'm going to come at it a little different angle, but I hope it speaks to that. I'm going to reach into my sermon today, which was, how do you know the will of God? And I used the Micah passage, that is to do justice, to love kindness, walk humbly with your God, and the United Church of Christ Congregational Covenant, which says, passion for righteousness, and something about truth. I can't remember what the qualifier is, but they are really emotional words that as Christians, it isn't just head knowledge. It isn't just, okay, try and be righteous. It's have a passion for righteousness, have a yearning for truth that is just love kindness. Don't just do kindness, but love kindness. They're emotional words, which I think oftentimes we leave the emotional out, and we almost become, well, here are the rules, be kind, but no, this requires a transformation of our emotional passions, which I don't always understand, to be honest.
Well, your remarks also make me think that when Jesus first told those parables, both the one of the separating of the nations based on how you treat one another, I was hungry and you didn't give me anything to eat, I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink, that whole notion shocked the people when they heard it, because there was nothing about righteousness, there was nothing about purity codes, there was nothing about being wise and not a fool, there was nothing about your Sabbath law keeping, there's nothing about generous donations to the temple, there was nothing about anything they said was important in God's eyes. And instead it was stuff that anybody could do. I'm hungry, so you gave me something to eat. I was naked and you gave me some clothes. I was sick and you took care of me. I said, well, yeah, when did we do that to you? I mean, we do that to people. He says, yes, when you do it to people, you're doing it to me. Like, that was shocking. And then the one with Lazarus being the one who's welcome to Abraham's bosom with blessing, and the angels are singing. And meanwhile, the rich guy's being munched on in the hereafter by demons in Hades, a place that didn't even exist in reality, but he used that picture. It shocked them. So I think that one of the things we've missed is the shock. There's no surprise. We know how the story goes. We know the one that is kind is going to be the one that wins in the end. We know that the one who's arrogant and doesn't pay attention is going to be hurt in the end. We need to shock ourselves with those stories again.
And part of it is I'm struck over and over again how little the scripture cares about the afterlife.
Yeah.
It's about how we live.
You know, we make that, and the church has made that kind of like a central thing. You know, are you going to go to heaven? Jesus, you take a look at all of his parables and stuff, and like we said, if you look at the Old Testament, you don't find hell mentioned. You find it mentioned in the New Testament, but not very much. It's not a real central concern, I think, for Jesus.
Well, one of the nice things about this chapter, even the way that Brian McLaren begins it, is to say this was a new innovation that was just getting brought into Judaism in Jesus' day. It was something that everybody was talking about. They came up with this new way of figuring out how to solve the problem of justice in this world by taking care of it with a better justice in the future. After we're gone, things will be different. Well, that whole way of thinking came from the Zoroastrians, and it came from the Greeks, the Hades notion. It came from actually the Nordic hell. I mean, it comes from all those other outside sources, whereas the Bible itself looked at how do we live in this world in a God-pleasing way. How do we do that which is appropriate, just, righteous in this world? Because that's the one that we are to have, as Jesus' prayer says, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. If we project heaven to be a whole different sphere after we're gone, different rules, different celestial beings, different rules of... We need to get back to what this chapter did, and that is, it's change your focus on how we think about God's work in this world, and what is God intending for us.
And if you talk about the passion part, it's be part of God's transformation. Let God transform you. And that's
do not be conformed to this world,
yeah.
but be transformed
Or,
by the renewal of
to
your
use that
mind.
scary word, allow yourself to be changed.
Mhm.
Because change is your ally, it's not your enemy. Change is how the world moves forward, and that's what we hope. That's, I think, what Jesus, in bringing his conversations about hell, he was tipping it over in order to bring change into people's lives for the good.
How often
Change for
is
the
that
good.
done, Paul? The tipping over, the turning upside down, it's done over and over
I think,
again.
well, if
by him, constantly.
yeah, I say every day is a new day, a new opportunity to get it right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that will be today's conversation about chapter 24, and thanks for coming to Brian McLaren's conversation.